Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling a topic that's especially interesting, I think, for our philosophy fans out there.
Mm.
We're talking about intentional transitive verbs, ITVs for short. And our guide for this journey is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, ITVs. These are really fascinating.
Yeah, they are.
They really kind of challenge some basic assumptions that we have about how language hooks onto the world, you know?
Yeah.
They don't quite play by the same rules as those straightforward verbs that we're used to using every day.
Exactly. So before we even get to the intentional part, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with transitive.
Right.
That just means that the verb takes a direct object.
Yeah.
Like eat in the sentence, I ate the meat,
Right.
as opposed to like, I ate then left,
Yeah.
where eat doesn't have a direct object.
Exactly.
So that part's simple enough, but when you add intentional to the mix, that's where things start to get a little bit tricky.
Yeah. It's like suddenly the meaning of the verb isn't just about, the action or the state that it describes, but it's also about something more, right? Like a way of thinking about the world or relating to things in it.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. Give me an example.
Sure. So think about the verb admire. Let's say you admire Mark Twain, the author.
Okay,
Now, we know that Mark Twain is actually Samuel Clemens.
right.
But would you necessarily admire Samuel Clemens?
Well, that's a good question. It kind of depends, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I didn't know that Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens were the same person, maybe I wouldn't admire Samuel Clemens. You know what I mean?
Right. And that's precisely what makes ITVs so fascinating.
Okay.
That even though those two terms, Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens, refer to the same guy in the real world, swapping them in and out of a sentence with an ITV can change whether the sentence is true or not.
Ah, so it's like, okay, so even though they're literally the same person, the sentence, Lois Lane admires Superman, might be true.
Yep.
While the sentence, Lois Lane admires Clark Kent, could be false.
Exactly. And this is our first big clue that something more is going on with ITVs. This is what we call substitution resistance.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely a head-scratcher. Are there other quirks like this that set ITVs apart from those kind of more basic verbs we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, there are. Another hallmark of ITVs is what we call specificance-specific ambiguity.
Okay,
Take the sentence, Oedipus is seeking a member of his family.
right.
Now, this could mean that he's looking for a particular person, like Jocasta, even though he doesn't know it yet.
Right.
Or it could mean that he just wants to find any relative, whoever that might be.
Ah, okay, so it's like adding a little phrase to the end of that sentence, like Oedipus is seeking a member of his family, but no particular one.
Exactly.
I can see how that second reading, that kind of unspecific reading, is something that you just can't do with a regular, more basic verb. Like, Oedipus embraced a member of his family, but no particular one. That just sounds weird.
It does. It sounds weird.
Right.
And that unspecific reading, that's another key feature of a lot of ITVs. And then there's a third mark of intentionality. It's called existence neutrality.
Existence neutrality.
And what this means is that you can seek something or want something that doesn't actually exist in the real world.
Okay.
Like the Fountain of Youth, for example. You can want it even though it's not real. But you can't, stumble across something that isn't there.
That's true, yeah.
Right. Stumble across is very much tied to things that actually exist.
Right. So it's almost like these verbs they're less tied to the real world than just, your average run-of-the-mill verb. I'm starting to see why they're so fascinating to philosophers.
Yeah.
So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they actually break down ITVs into different types,
Big deal.
each with their own, quirks and, strange little behaviors. What are some of the main categories that we should be thinking about here?
Well, we've already touched on a couple of the big ones. Search verbs, things like seek, and desire verbs, things like want. They both pretty clearly exhibit all three of those marks of intentionality that we just talked about.
Gotcha. And then there are depiction verbs, right? Things like draw or imagine. I remember reading about an example with a museum.
Ah, yes, the Guercino painting.
Yeah.
So the museum label insisted that Guercino had painted a specific dog. And this is key, because with depiction verbs, Guercino drew a dog could mean that he just made one up. Not based on any real dog at all. And they also interact with quantifiers in interesting ways. Words like every, most, or the.
How so?
Well, if you say Guercino drew every dog, that sentence has to be referring to a specific group of dogs that already exist.
Oh,
Like all the dogs in a particular town, for example. You
right.
can't have that unspecific reading where he's just drawing dogs in general.
That is interesting. It seems like each of these categories of ITVs kind of comes with its own, almost its own little rule book.
Yeah.
So what about evaluative verbs? Things like, respect, admire, fear. Where do those fit into all of this?
Evaluative verbs, they're a bit trickier. They definitely show that substitution resistance.
Okay.
Lex Luthor, he might fear Superman but not Clark Kent, even though they're the same person. But those unspecific readings, they're a bit harder to pin down with these verbs. You can have generic readings,
Mm-hmm.
like Lois admires an extraterrestrial, meaning that she admires them as a species, but Lois admires an extraterrestrial but no particular one. That doesn't quite work.
It doesn't have the same ring to it.
It doesn't, does it?
Okay, so some categories are more clear-cut than others, it seems. Are there any real outliers? Verbs that just, they don't really fit neatly into any of these boxes?
There are some really interesting edge cases. Need, for example.
Neat, okay.
Need allows for the substitution of co-referring terms. So needing water is the same as needing H2O. But if you try to swap in terms that just happen to refer to the same group in the actual world but aren't necessarily the same thing, things get a bit weird. Like that example with singer and dancer.
Oh, right. Even if every singer is a dancer, you could still need more singers without needing more dancers.
Exactly. And then you have transaction verbs, things like buy, own, you know. These act pretty similar to need when it comes to substitution.
Okay. So we've got all these different types of ITVs, each with their own little quirks and exceptions and, strange behaviors. It makes you wonder, is there some sort of underlying principle that ties all of this together? Like, is there one grand theory that can explain how all of these verbs work?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And as you might expect, there's no easy answer. Philosophers have come up with a lot of different theories, each with their own strengths and weaknesses.
Of course.
But that's a conversation for the next part of our deep dive.
So we've established that ITVs, they're a bit of a puzzle.
They are, yeah, a philosophical puzzle.
But how do philosophers actually go about trying to solve this puzzle? Where do they even begin?
Well, one of the big questions is whether those three quirks of ITVs that we talked about, substitution resistance, unspecific readings, and existence neutrality,
Right.
whether those all stem from some kind of single underlying mechanism or whether they require, separate explanations.
So it's like, are they all different facets of the same diamond, or are we actually dealing with three totally different gems here?
That's a great way to put it. And the more you start to examine these verbs, the more complex the picture becomes, really.
Yeah.
Take need versus want, for example.
Okay.
They act very differently when it comes to that substitution idea.
Okay.
You need H2O even if you don't want it.
Right.
But they both allow for those unspecific readings. I need a car and I want a car can both mean that you don't have a particular car in mind.
So maybe those two marks of intentionality, substitution resistance and unspecific readings, maybe they aren't as tightly linked as we initially thought.
That's right. And then you have those tricky evaluative verbs like admire.
Right.
They clearly show substitution resistance.
Yeah.
But those unspecific readings, they're a bit harder to find. It's like you can have those generic readings. Lois admires an extraterrestrial, meaning she admires them as a species.
Right.
But Lois admires an extraterrestrial, but no particular one, that doesn't quite work.
No, it doesn't have the same ring to it. Okay, so maybe we are dealing with different mechanisms here. But how do we even begin to explain those? What are the leading contenders, in this philosophical battle royale?
Well, two main approaches come to mind. Propositionalism, and then there's Montague's semantics.
Okay. Let's break those down one by one. So propositionalism, what's the core idea there?
Well, propositionalism argues that there are these kind of hidden clauses within these ITVs, like secret sentences, tucked away beneath the surface.
Hidden clauses. So, there's a whole other level to these verbs that we don't even see at first glance.
Right. Exactly.
So it's not just Lois is looking for an extraterrestrial, but there's something more going on beneath that simple sentence.
Yeah. And one classic example is Quine's attempt to paraphrase search verbs.
Right.
He suggested that Lois is looking for an extraterrestrial actually means Lois is endeavoring to find an extraterrestrial.
Okay.
So the idea is to kind of unpack this implicit content that's wrapped up in the verb itself.
Endeavoring to find. I mean, I can see how that adds an extra layer of meaning there, but it does seem like a bit of a mouthful. You know what I mean? Does that kind of paraphrasing work for other ITVs?
Well, while Quine's specific paraphrase might not be perfect, there's actually stronger evidence for those hidden clauses with verbs like need and want.
Okay.
Think about the sentence, physics needs some new computers soon.
Okay. Physics needs new computers soon.
Soon.
Hmm.
There, it seems to be modifying the getting of the computers, right? Not the needing itself.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's almost like there's an unspoken get tucked in
Yep.
there somewhere.
Exactly. And there are other kind of linguistic clues that point towards this propositionalist view. Things like propositional anaphora, attachment ambiguities, ellipsis.
Okay.
These all point to the presence of these hidden clauses within what seem to be, these really simple verbs.
So propositionalism seems like it holds some weight, at least for those verbs, need
Mm.
and want. But what about those other categories? Do depiction verbs or evaluative verbs, do those have those hidden clauses too?
That's where propositionalism starts to run into some trouble.
Okay.
It's much harder to come up with those really clear propositional paraphrases for verbs like, draw or fear. For instance, fearing something, it isn't the same as fearing that you will encounter that thing. You could fear, the encounter itself, not just the thing you're encountering.
Right, right, right. The hidden clause would have to capture like all the subtle nuances of the original verb, which is, yeah, this seems like a pretty tall order.
It does. So propositionalism might be a good fit for some ITVs, but it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay. So what about Montague's semantics? How does that approach deal with these verbs?
Montague semantics, well, it's a whole other beast altogether. It's
Yeah.
what we call a higher order approach.
Higher order.
It means that it deals with properties of properties, and it's non-propositionalist. So no hidden clauses here.
Properties of properties. Okay, that's
Mhm.
that's a little abstract. How does that help us understand something like Jack wants a woolen sweater?
All right, so imagine like a huge library, right?
Okay.
And each book represents a property. In Montague's framework, when you say Jack wants a woolen sweater, you're not saying that he wants a specific sweater, like a particular book from that library.
Right.
What you're saying is that he wants the property being a property of a woolen sweater. It's like wanting to be in the woolen sweater section of the library, not wanting a specific book from that section.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the picture here. So instead of saying Jack wants it to be the case that he has a woolen sweater,
Mm.
we're saying he desires a certain kind of property, one that's related to woolen sweaters. But how does this approach deal with those three marks of intentionality?
Well, it actually handles them quite elegantly.
Okay.
Existence neutrality is already built in because you can want the property of being a woolen sweater even if no such sweater exists, right?
Right, right.
And substitution resistance is addressed by treating those contingently coextensive terms. So terms that just happen to refer to the same thing in the actual world
Ugh.
as being different properties. So even though Superman and Clark Kent are the same guy,
Hmm.
in Montague's semantics, they're treated as having different properties.
But what about those cases where the terms necessarily refer to the same thing? Like water and H2O. Does Montague's semantics run into trouble there?
That's a really tricky one.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's a limitation of any kind of possible world semantics, not just Montague's. It's a tough nut to crack.
It is, yeah.
But there's an even deeper philosophical question here. Does Montague's approach truly capture what we call the notional reading?
What do you mean by notional in this context?
It's about whether wanting the property of being a property of a woolen sweater, if that actually makes sense as a real desire that somebody could have.
Right. Like, does that actually reflect what's going on in our minds when we desire something? It does seem a bit, it can feel like a little bit philosophical, jargony, a little detached from lived experience.
Right, exactly. And so even Montague's semantics, as powerful as it is, it still has its critics and its unsolved mysteries. These ITVs, they're just full of surprises.
Yeah, they are. And speaking of surprises, there's another puzzle involving ITVs that I think is even more mind-bending than the ones we've talked about so far.
Oh.
It really throws a wrench into our understanding of how substitution works.
All right, you got my attention. I want to hear about this.
So tell me, what's this even more mind-bending puzzle you mentioned?
Well, it's called Pryor's puzzle, and it kind of takes this whole substitution thing, which we've already seen can be pretty tricky with ITVs.
Right.
It takes it to a whole new level.
Okay.
It starts with the idea that we can describe propositions in two ways.
Okay.
We can use those like that clauses,
Right, right.
that Moriarty has returned.
Right.
Or we can use explicit noun phrases like, the proposition that Moriarty has returned.
So two different ways of saying the same thing.
Exactly.
It's kind of like how I can refer to my dog as, like, Fido or, the furry friend that I'm petting right now.
Precisely.
Right.
Now, if those two ways of describing a proposition really do pick out the same thing,
Right.
we should be able to substitute one for the other without changing, the truth of the sentence.
Okay.
And that works just fine with verbs like believe.
Okay.
Holmes believes that Moriarty has returned.
Right.
Seems to logically entail Holmes believes the proposition that Moriarty has returned.
Yeah. Seems straightforward enough.
Right. But of course, we're talking about Pryor's puzzle here.
Right.
So there's a twist.
Of course.
The twist is that this substitution idea breaks down for a whole bunch of other verbs. Take fear, for instance. Holmes fears that Moriarty has returned. That may be true.
Okay, yeah.
But Holmes fears the proposition that Moriarty has returned.
It's like saying Holmes is afraid of an abstract concept.
Right. It just sounds bizarre.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense in the same way.
It doesn't. And it's not just fear either, This
Right.
pattern holds for tons of other verbs. Suspect, announce, hope, realize.
So it's like we've hit this fundamental inconsistency in how language actually works.
It seems that way.
Yeah, because if those two ways of describing a proposition really are referring to the same thing,
Right.
why does the meaning change so drastically when we try to swap them?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Like, what are the possible explanations here? What could be going on?
Well, some philosophers, they think that maybe the problem is with our assumptions about proposition descriptions.
Okay.
Maybe those phrases like the proposition that Moriarty has returned.
Right.
Maybe they don't always refer to exactly what we think they do. Maybe
uh.
there are some, hidden ambiguities there that we haven't fully grasped.
So it's not like a straightforward one-to-one substitution after all.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Others have suggested that, maybe it's the verbs themselves that are the problem.
Okay.
Maybe the transitive and clausal forms of verbs like fear actually have subtly different meanings, even though they seem to be talking about the same, basic concept.
Oh, interesting.
Right. Kind of like how look can have multiple meanings,
Yeah.
depending on the context.
Like look puzzle, all those. Yeah.
Right. They're all doing slightly different things.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's this idea that maybe event semantics can help shed some light on this puzzle.
Event semantics. Okay.
This approach kind of focuses on the roles that a proposition can play within an event.
Okay.
So maybe, that Moriarty has returned represents, the content of Holmes's fear.
Yeah.
While the proposition that Moriarty has returned represents more like the theme of his fear. Like the thing that he's fearing about.
So the proposition itself becomes the object of the fear rather than, the content of the fear.
Right, exactly.
That is a really fascinating distinction.
It is, yeah.
It seems like everywhere we turn with these ITVs, we just keep going deeper and deeper down these rabbit holes of linguistic and philosophical complexity.
That's the fun of it, though, right?
I guess so, yeah.
There's always something more to explore.
Well, beyond all of these substitution puzzles,
Right.
there's another fascinating aspect to these ITVs, and that's their logic.
Yeah.
Logic, huh? As in, if A, then B.
Exactly.
How do these seemingly, unruly verbs
Right.
fit into this, neat world of logic?
Well, it all comes down to the kinds of inferences that we can draw from sentences that contain ITVs. Okay. And at first glance, they seem to behave in a more logically straightforward way than, say, propositional attitudes.
Okay.
For instance, Mary seeks a man who has read Proust and a man who has read Gide.
Okay.
That seems to pretty clearly entail that Mary seeks a man who has read Proust.
Yeah, she's looking for both of them. She's definitely looking for at least one of them.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But it gets a bit more complicated when we consider the implications of those unspecific readings. For example, if Mary seeks a man who has read Proust,
Okay.
does that automatically mean that she seeks a man who can read?
Well, I mean, logically speaking, you'd think so.
Right.
You can't read Proust if you can't read at all.
You would think.
Right. But with these ITVs, it's not always so clear cut.
Exactly.
Right.
It might not be what she means.
Hmm.
She might have very particular literary tastes, and she wouldn't be satisfied with just any guy who can read.
It's like that example in the article with the wanting a free ticket on the Concorde.
Exactly.
Just because you want a free ticket doesn't mean that you want a ticket in general, especially if those tickets are, really expensive.
Exactly. So the logic of ITVs gets a little bit fuzzy
Yeah.
when we factor in those unspecific readings.
Their meaning isn't always like, totally transparent.
Right.
What other like logical quirks do they have?
Another really interesting case is disjunction
Disjunction. Okay.
sentences with or in them.
Okay.
So Jack needs a woolen sweater or a fleece jacket.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that he needs both, right?
Right. Either one would do the trick.
Exactly. But it does imply that getting a woolen sweater would meet his need,
Okay.
and getting a fleece jacket would also meet his need.
Interesting.
It's like there's this conjunctive force kind of lurking within that or.
Conjunctive force. So there's an and hiding in that
Ah.
or, but not in the way that we usually think about it.
Exactly. It's another example of how these ITVs just defy our expectations and make us kind of rethink our assumptions about logic and language.
Wow. This has really been like a whirlwind tour of the world of ITVs.
It has.
We've seen how they challenge our understanding of meaning, reference, substitution, even logic.
All the big ones.
Yeah, it seems like we've only just scratched the surface of what these verbs can teach us.
That's right. And as philosophers, we're left with some really big questions, right?
Right.
What might the logic of these ITVs tell us about how we think about and interact with the world?
Yeah.
Are there any practical consequences to understanding these subtle nuances of language?
Right.
Do they shape how we form beliefs, make decisions, maybe even how we experience emotions?
So many questions, so little time.
Isn't that always the case?
I guess so. That's the beauty of philosophy, I suppose.
It is.
Just kind of embracing the mystery and continuing to explore these like uncharted territories of thought.
Absolutely.
Well, for anyone who wants to dive even deeper into this fascinating world of ITVs,
Right.
I definitely recommend checking out that full Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy article.
Oh, yeah. It's a great resource.
It's a treasure trove of insights for, anyone who's willing to take the plunge.
a real deep dive.
That's all for this deep dive.
Until next time.
Until next time, everyone, keep those minds curious and never stop questioning the world around you.